Hello and welcome to episode 33 of the Abbasid History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamicate history and a global medieval past. And our second instalment of a 12-part series entitled A Spring of Classical Arabic Poetry with Dr. Kevin Blankinship at Brigham Young University in Utah. Part 7, al-Mutanabbī, 915 to 965 Common Era, the Shakespeare of the Arabs. We are sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHRC Bookshop for details. I'm your host, Talha Hassan, a PhD student at School of Oriental African Studies. Now onto the show. Abu al-Tayyib Ahmad bin al-Hussein al-Kindi, better known as al-Mutanabbī, is considered one of the greatest poets of the Arabic language. He had a reputation of being big-headed, and his lines are still cited frequently today and often proverbial. Yet he remains little known in the English language, despite some masterful translations. Is this hype as the Shakespeare of the Arabs justified? To discuss with me the life, work and legacy of al-Mutanabbī is Dr. Kevin Blankinship. Welcome, Dr. Blankinship.
Hi, Talha. Good to be with you.
Al-Mutanabbī was born in 915 Common Era in the city of Kufah in modern-day Iraq at the height of the Abbasid caliphate, but with rising challenges from sectarian foes. What do we know about al-Mutanabbī's socio-political context?
This was an age of political and social turmoil. Within al-Mutanabbī's lifetime, the Cordoban Umayyads in present-day Spain would go on to declare a caliphate, and the Fatimid Ismaili Shiite caliphate would conquer Egypt and build Cairo as their capital. And both of these centers of power chipped away at the Abbasids' traditional claim to authority. But even then, the Abbasids were already losing their grip. Al-Mutanabbī lived and died during what Vladimir Minorsky called the Iranian Intermezzo. And this was a period of about 2 centuries in which some 6 or 7 Persianate dynasties came to rule and revived Persian nationalism and culture within an Islamic coloring. And these dynasties included the Tahirids, the Saffarids, the Sajids, the Samanids, the Ziyarids, and the Buyids. Speaking of the Ismaili Fatimids, another factor that sort of contributed to political instability were the actions of the Qaramatis, a revolutionary sect who broke away from the Fatimid Ismaili dynasty over that dynasty's support of Ubayd Allah al-Mahdi. The Qaramatis considered the pilgrimage to Mecca a superstition, outside the mainstream, to say the least. They established a mini-state in Bahrain from which they launched raids along the pilgrim routes crossing the Arabian Peninsula. In 906, they ambushed the pilgrim caravan returning from Mecca and massacred some 20,000 pilgrims. They sacked Mecca and Medina in 930, desecrating the Zamzam well with corpses of Hajj pilgrims, and stole the Black Stone and held it for 3 decades. And as you can imagine, this violence contributed to the overall political instability of the period and the perception of such stability. The Qaramatis had great success with their propaganda and attacked several important towns, and they included Kufah, where al-Mutanabbī was born. And this was also a time of increased ethnic diversity within Muslim realms, especially of Persians and Turks, due to the events I've already mentioned, plus the fact that various dynasties started relying on labor, slaves, and soldiers from other lands. This is important for al-Mutanabbī's context because he, in particular, was a staunch Arab partisan and took great pride in his southern Yemeni lineage. As he says in one of his earliest poems, people are measured by their kings, and no Arabs whose kings are non-Arab will ever prosper. In addition, al-Mutanabbī made his literary career at a time when poets who were lucky enough could secure a plum position as a court poet to praise a patron. And you could make a lot of money doing this. I always think of a story told not about an Arabic poet, but a Persian one, Andani, who studied astronomy and the sciences to make a living for himself and develop a career. And then one day, supposedly, he saw a ruler's caravan pass by, and up on this horse was this well-dressed gentleman who, appeared to be very wealthy and well off and comfortable. This was the court poet. And he said, well, I could toil away studying something really hard like astronomy and science, or I could do something like poetry, which doesn't seem so bad, and make a lot of money doing it. And these images of sort of the lavish lifestyle obviously go against the stereotype of the penurious poet trying to eke out a living. And even Anvari himself, his fortunes declined later in his life, which led to sort of him persistently complaining against the caprice of fate.
Al-Mutanabī was educated in Damascus and is said to have participated in those very Qaramatian revolts which you mentioned, which we also covered in episode 13 as Dr. Andani. What do we know about al-Mutanabbi's life, and what is the origin of his name?
At the outset, as you asked this question, I have to say how daunted I feel talking about this larger-than-life figure within the history of Arabic literature and Arabic poetry. My hope is to do him a little bit of justice, although I'm sure I'll fall short. Al-Mutanabī was born into a poor family in Kufah in central southern Iraq. His father was a water carrier, which the Kinda quarter of Kufah was known for. That's where al-Mutanabī was born and raised. His nisba is al-Ju'fi, which he's sometimes called in pre-modern sources just al-Ju'fi, and everyone knows who that refers to. Generally, it refers to al-Mutanabī. And that nisba indicates Yemeni Arab tribal lineage, something he was fiercely proud of in an age of, as I mentioned, increasing ethnic diversity. When al-Mutanabī was 15, he moved to Syria to launch his career as a praise poet. And at this time, he wrote several praise poems to sort of anyone who would pay him. Like you do when you're starting off with any career, you sort of, develop whatever contacts that you can and put yourself out there, as they say. This meant he ended up writing for patrons with little to no significance. And his poetry from this period also boasts in his own ability as a warrior. For example, he wrote, "More pleasant than old choice wine, and sweeter than passing round the cup, is handling broadswords and tall lances, and me, thrusting one army into another." This is ironic because some sources say apparently at this time, al-Mutanabī could barely mount a horse or put his weaponry together. But that never stopped al-Mutanabī from boasting about anything, his inability to actually do things. But even his early poetry is so accomplished, it's easy to forget that he was just a teenager. And we wouldn't be far off to call him a child prodigy, even at this young age, who's producing some really great poetry. It was during his Syria period that events supposedly took place that earned him the nickname al-Mutanabī, the would-be prophet, which the poet himself actually didn't like and said was the result of childish things that he did in his youth. So, sources tell us that in 934, he went to Latakia in present-day Syria, the third such trip that he made during his youth. And there he met a certain Abdullah Mu'adh ibn Ismail, who is credited with the main narrative about this episode. Al-Mutanabī supposedly declared to this Abdullah Mu'adh that he was a prophet, and as evidence, he presented his own Quran, with 114 chapters like the actual Quran. The story attributed to Abdullah Mu'adh quotes some passages from this document, attributed to it anyway. Al-Mutanabī also apparently tried to do some minor miracles, like stopping the rain from falling in one place while all around him the rain was pouring down in other areas. Wolfhart Heinrichs made the case in an article that these associations with al-Mutanabī might have originated with Gnostic Shiites. The poet himself later denied these charges. He said his nickname came from misunderstood lines of his poetry, like this one. "My stay in the abode of Nakhla is like nothing if not the sojourn of the Messiah among the Jews." So shortly after his encounter with Mu'adh, and after his fame had spread among the Bedouin, al-Mutanabī led the tribes of the Samawa region of the Syrian desert in a series of raids. And these disruptions expanded to Salamiya, the northeast of the Syrian city of Homs. And finally, the Ikhshidid appointed governor of Homs, Lu'lu al-Ghuri, sent out an army against these tribes as they were raiding, and al-Mutanabī was captured. And he spent 2 years in prison from 934 to 936 and was released only after a jailer took pity on him. He had become gravely ill, al-Mutanabī, and transmitted a poetic appeal from him to the new governor, Ishaq ibn Kayghulur. An influential figure seems to have interceded on his behalf, and the poet had to agree to a public recanting of his crime of heresy. So after this, he spent the next few years wandering again, looking for the brass ring of patronage. He finally found it at the court of Sayf ad-Dawlaṭ al-Hamdani in Aleppo in northern Syria. He stayed there for 9 years and wrote the bulk of his best-known poetry at that court. And he enjoyed great favor in the ruler's sight, partly because he and Sayf ad-Dawla had similar personalities. They both took great pride in their Arabness. They both took great pride in their ability as warriors. Sayf ad-Dawla had some grounds for this, and al-Mutanabī might or might not have. And al-Mutanabī wasn't the only panegyrist in Sayf ad-Dawla's entourage. As listeners will be familiar at this time, it was sort of like a luxury commodity for a ruler to pay for there to be erudite people from various fields at court. You'd have a court philosopher, a court poet, jurists, and other people. And again, sort of as like conspicuous consumption, almost, a ruler might have salons whereby all these learned people would sit and discuss various topics. And so there was great competition for Sayf ad-Dawla's admiration, especially monetary rewards dispensed by the prince. Al-Mutanabī was seen by many to be hogging the show, which again is not hard to believe given what remains of his poetry. And his natural arrogance added fuel to this conspiratorial fire. For example, early in 952, one of the first signs of trouble between Al-Mutanabī and his enemies, he declared provocatively in the course of a poem to his patron, "My two friends, I do not see other than one poet. So how is it that from them comes the claim to be poets, and from me, the actual poems?" And one of the people he sparred with was Sayf ad-Dawla's cousin, Abu Firas al-Hamdani, another poet who we'll talk about in the next episode of this series of episodes about Arabic poetry. Now, as for how al-Mutanabī finally left Sayf ad-Dawla's court, the story goes that in one of these scholarly debates that took place, it degenerated into a competition between al-Mutanabī and the grammarian Ibn Khalawayh. Now, although al-Mutanabī was clearly winning the battle, he saw fit to insult Ibn Khalawayh, who is ethnically Persian, as his name indicates. Khalawayh is a diminutive in Persian. And al-Mutanabī supposedly said, on a point of grammar, "You'd better keep still. You're a Persian from Khuzestan. What do you have to do with the Arabic language?" And Ibn Khalawayh got furious and hit the poet in the face with either his hand or a key, depending on the source of the narrative. In some accounts, al-Mutanabī's comment occurred as a reaction to Ibn Khalawayh's pulling out his key and just threatening the poet. Either way, the result was the same, and al-Mutanabī ended up with blood all over his face. Sayf ad-Dawla said nothing. And when he did so, when he failed to intervene or comment, it was clear that al-Mutanabī's days at the Hamdanid court had come to an end. To paraphrase the song, like all true love, it withered on the vine. So al-Mutanabī left the court in 957. He was 42. Once again, on the move, seeking a patron, only this time he was a well-known and well-sought-after poet. And so the Ikhshidid regent of Egypt at the time, Abul Misk Kafur, who was a Nubian slave and had worked his way up into a position of authority. And this fact comes into play later, his ethnicity and his status as a former slave, invited al-Mutanabī to be a court poet at Fustat, which was the capital city of Egypt before the Fatimids established Cairo 2 decades later. Even after his arrival at Fustat in August of 957 to a grand reception at Kafur's opulent court, al-Mutanabī, who might have had his eye on the court of one of the Ikhshidid viziers, resisted the regent's overtures. Only with a promise of a governorship, perhaps of Sidon, was Kafur able to win over the poet. So in September of that same year, al-Mutanabī recited his first poem as an official panegyrist to Kafur. Al-Mutanabī stayed there for 2 years, relatively short compared to his almost decade at the court of Sayf ad-Dawla. And he churned out praise poems, although he was reluctant to do so. Kafur was not al-Mutanabī's ideal patron, not least because he wasn't Arab. And also Kafur hemmed and hawed and hesitated on his promise of a governorship for al-Mutanabī, which again was one of these conditions for al-Mutanabī becoming his court poet. In early 959, the poet saw the writing on the wall and wrote what is some of the most biting and ugly satire in Arabic. It's devoid of sort of the irony of his earlier poems, gently chiding Sayf ad-Dawla, not least because this later poetry to Kafur offends modern sensibilities about race, just as a caveat as we read some of the lines. So al-Mutanabī wrote, among other things, More stupid than a slave and his woman is one who makes a slave his ruler. The slave's nature is considered with nothing but his fetid genitals or his molars. He does not make good on his promise on the appointed day and does not remember what he said yesterday. Do not expect good from a man over whose head the slave trader's hand has passed. If you have doubts about the way he is, just take a look at his race. Whoever finds a way out of his rank can't also get away from his origins. Obviously, this did not sit well with Kafur, his praise poet, his propagandist by another name, writing stuff like this. So from Egypt, al-Mutanabbī spent time in his hometown of Kufah, and then at the Buyid court of Ibn al-Amid in Ar-Rajan. And in his praise poetry to Ibn al-Amid, Mutanabbī, it's interesting because he spent this whole time, all these years, vaunting Arab identity. Al-Mutanabbī contrasts his native Arab culture and formation and the Persian identity and environment of his new patron, and brings sort of the two into relief and declares a preference for the latter. The interests of capitalism, I guess, trump, when you have to put food on the table, trump the interests of your principles. Everyone has a price, I guess. So al-Mutanabbī claims in these poems that Ibn al-Amid encompasses all that Bedouin culture had to offer and surpasses it, being like Ptolemy, at once Bedouin and city dweller. So here are a couple of lines from some of that poetry. Who will inform the desert Arabs that after them I have seen Aristotle and Alexander? I tired of slaughtering she-camels, so I was entertained by one who sacrifices bags of gold for those he hosts. And I heard Ptolemy studying his books, at once king, Bedouin, and city dweller. I met him in all the men of learning, as if God had restored their souls and their eras. During these later years, al-Mutanabbī never totally lost contact with Sayf ad-Dawlaṭ, although his window of opportunity to be at court there had certainly closed. He continued writing for patrons in Persia, but really longed for his home of Iraq. So on a journey back to Baghdad, he stopped in Wasit with his son al-Muhassad. He learned that among the Bedouins who were raiding in the region at that time was Fatik ibn Abi al-Jahl, the uncle of Dabba ibn Yazid al-Utbi, whom al-Mutanabbī had lampooned during the Kufah rebellions the year before. It was clear that this situation could be hazardous to al-Mutanabbī's health. So al-Mutanabbī refused an escort for safe passage, even though he knew this, and in September 965, the poet and his companions were attacked by Fatik's band. They were outnumbered, and al-Mutanabbī, his son, and several of his servants died. According to one report, the poet, after fiercely battling off his attackers, was on the verge of fleeing when he was coaxed back into action by one of his slaves who said, "What happened to that verse of yours? The horses and the night and the desert, they know me. So too the sword and the spear and the paper and the pen." And so he went back to his fate. According to another report, al-Mutanabbī was carrying heavily annotated copies of diwans by at-Ta'iyin, the two Ta'is, and that refers to Abu Tammam and al-Buhturi, who featured in previous episodes of this series. And al-Buhturi was a member of Buhtur, the branch of the Ta'i tribe. This is supposed to illustrate the impact the two earlier poets had on al-Mutanabbī's style, as well as al-Mutanabbī's devotion to his art to the very last, which for me always calls to mind the supposed death of al-Jahid after he was crushed to death beneath a pile of his own books. So al-Mutanabbī was 50 when he died. I'm almost 40 for those who are listening, and for someone to have accomplished all of this at such a young age, I feel like I have a lot to catch up to. Poets throughout the Islamic world praised him. One of them was his devoted student Ibn Jinni, who went on to become a famous figure in himself as a grammarian, who said, "Poetry has sunk into the earth, and the bloom of literature withered, and the lush tree of letters, once abundantly watered, has dried up."
Al-Mutanabbī is particularly known as being the court poet of Sayf ad-Dawlaṭ, ruler of Aleppo, as you mentioned. How would you characterize al-Mutanabbī's works more broadly?
Al-Mutanabbi's output was robust, certainly, but relatively short. We have about 5,000 lines by him compared to 11,000 by al-Buhturi, for example. During his 9 years at the court of Sayf ad-Dawlaṭ at Aleppo, al-Mutanabbī wrote some 40 odes, as well as 31 shorter occasional poems on specific events or occasions. Sayf ad-Dawlaṭ also expected the poets to participate actively in the diverse intellectual debates and discussion, which I mentioned. And al-Mutanabī was known to stay up all night to prepare for some of these gatherings. So for you PhD students out there preparing for your qualifying exams, you were not alone. Al-Mutanabī also would stay up all night preparing. Military campaigns were often the topic of al-Mutanabī's poems, and he praised Sayf ad-Dawla's courage and skill in battles against the Byzantines in particular. But these weren't the only occasions for al-Mutanabī's odes. He was also called on to write for ceremonial occasions, such as visits by Byzantine emissaries to the court at Aleppo. And in several odes composed on such occasions, al-Mutanabī strove to give his patron the upper hand in the ensuing negotiations by exaggerating his power and status and diminishing that of the Christian visitors. Another intriguing poem from al-Mutanabī's early days, before his stay at the court of Sayf ad-Dawla, was an elegy that he wrote for the death of his grandmother. It's very tender and touching. In the poem, he reshapes sort of the traditional poetic mode of elegy and makes it a dynamic space in which his own greatness, as in so many other poems, becomes a vehicle for his recovery from grief, ironically. And he sort of gives a miniature narrative in which he imagines his grandmother receiving a letter from him. She marvels at my handwriting and my words, as if she is seeing in the lines of letters white-winged ravens. And she kisses it until its ink has turned the area around her eyes and her teeth black. Margaret Larkin has written that al-Mutanabī was constitutionally incapable of completely sanitizing his poetry of his own voice. This has always struck me personally as something about al-Mutanabī's poetry that sets him apart, which is that even as a praise poet, when he's supposed to be propagandizing and praising his patron, he always finds a way to slip in some lines about how great he, the poet, is. This is true even during the period right after his release from prison, again before he was with Sayf ad-Dawla, when al-Mutanabī was on quote-unquote good behavior as he tried to secure a patron.
In February 2021, NASA tweeted some lines by al-Mutanabī to congratulate the UAE satellite reaching Mars. Al-Mutanabī's reputation has now reached across the stars. That would have been very appealing to his reputed big head. How do we assess al-Mutanabī's legacy?
As many listeners will know, al-Mutanabī is by far the most widely memorized, transmitted, and commented upon poet in Arabic, which, as you, Talha, mentioned in the beginning, it's a shame that he's not better known in the English language, and partly that's because praise poetry from these periods, and actually in any linguistic tradition, really doesn't carry well if we're thinking in poetry in the terms we normally think of it, which is, as William Wordsworth said, the spontaneous overflow of emotion. The poems that we think of are about interiority. They're about the poet sort of expressing his subjectivity. And so when you read poetry that's all about praising a patron, it sounds like a commercial that you'd see on TV. It's not something we normally think of as poetry. So for that reason, I think, because in translation, the beauty and balance of the Arabic and the muscular kind of structure that he has in his poetry gets lost in translation. What's left is the content, which again doesn't really kind of come across. The 13th century biographer Ibn Khallikan already knew of more than 40 commentaries on his poetry, again by the 13th century. One of al-Mutanabbi's greatest devotees was Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri, who wrote not one but two commentaries on al-Mutanabbi's poetry. And al-Ma'arri's first collection of poetry, Saqt az-Zan, shows a major influence from al-Mutanabbi. I should also mention al-Mutanabbi's influence on Arabic language poets in the Islamic West, namely Iberia and North Africa. There's a book by Majd al-Mallah that I'd recommend called In the Shadows of the Master that explores this legacy. And it focuses on poets like Ibn Hani al-Andalusi and Tamim ibn al-Mu'izz. Both of them were poets in the Fatimid Ismaili realm. And Ibn Darraj al-Qastalli, who was a court poet in Muslim Iberia. These poets are sometimes anachronistically called neoclassical because they look back at the so-called classical poets like al-Mutanabī, Abu Tammam, al-Buhtari, and others in the quote-unquote golden age of Abbasid literature. And if I can briefly do a shameless plug here, I myself am researching and writing about the Western Islamic reception of canonized Abbasid poets like al-Mutanabī, but also Abu Tammam, al-Buhtari, al-Ma'arri, Abu al-Atahiyya, and others. Al-Mutanabī, of course, had a reputation for his ego, as you mentioned, Talha, He in one of his poems wrote, "Whoever can't sift my words from others, empty prattle, he only badmouths himself." Most of his poems are written in clear, stylish language and carry striking meaning that people still quote as maxims today. But some of his best-known lines don't translate very well because they rely on rhetorical devices. There's a very famous example, and this is an outlier in terms of the sort of rhetorical acrobatics that he uses. But for any Arabists out there, this might be a familiar line where he sort of repeats the same sounding words to actually mean something, but rhetorically creating a kind of a repetitive effect. So in Arabic, it sounds like this. Alamun alamma alam ulimmu bidaihi in ana anun ana anu awanihi. So I won't unpack every single one of these words, but you can look it up. But in English, it means a pain embraced me, whose disease I'd never known before, which when afflicted cries out in pain, when the afflicted person cries out in pain, the time for healing has come. So al-Mutanabī, most of his lines are a lot clearer than that, but he could sort of get caught up in the rhetorical elements like this. Another common ingredient in al-Mutanabbi's poetry is catachresis, meaning mixed or far-fetched metaphors. An example from English would be a famous line from Hamlet, "I'll speak daggers to her, but use none." So that speaking daggers would be considered kind of it's a bit of a stretch, but we can go along with it. A classic example is from a poem al-Mutanabī wrote in 960 after he left Kafur's court at Egypt about an illness that had laid him up for a long time. And he uses the startling conceit of he compares his fever to a mistress visiting him in the night. And so I'm going to quote a couple of lines from this, modifying from Rawad Wahbi's great MA thesis at UT Austin. Rawad is a current a NELC PhD student at University of Pennsylvania. My visitor appears looking bashful. She only visits in the dark. I made her a bed with cushions and throw pillows, but she refused and slept instead in my bones. My skin was too tight for both my sighing and her sighing, so she filled it with rot, making it her home. Commentators single this out as a very original conceit, but it is preceded by sayings like aghzal min al-humma, more visiting or more visitatious maybe than a fever. And on this wise, the poet is sighing so badly in the line where he's talking about how he doesn't have room for both his breath and hers, that his skin doesn't fit both of them. So she makes his skin broader by sickening him and wasting his flesh. As might seem obvious, not everyone liked some of these lines. Whole books sprang up evaluating al-Mutanabbi's poetry and fighting over his legacy, even during his lifetime and for a generation after. One of the earliest was by al-Qadi al-Jurjani, called Mediating Between al-Mutanabī and his opponents, al-Wasāṭa bayn al-Mutanabī wa khusumihi. And this al-Jurjani ultimately came down on the side of al-Mutanabī. And he said of his poetry that for every bad line his critics had come up with, there are 10 good lines. But he does admit that even al-Mutanabī nods sometimes. Critics thought al-Mutanabbi's expressions were too bizarre and his conceits too forced and demanding mental acrobatics from readers. In fact, a critic who lived after al-Mutanabbi's lifetime, Abd al-Qahir al-Jurjani, not to be confused with al-Qadi al-Jurjani, author of the book I just mentioned, Mediating Between al-Mutanabī and His Opponents, Abd al-Qahir al-Jurjani, this literary critic, would later say that such a demand on the reader is precisely how poetry is supposed to work, with these sort of conceits that force you into a new way of thinking. And his argument prefigures that of a Russian formalist named Viktor Shklovsky, who coined the term defamiliarization to describe what poetry does to language. So its perception is impeded, and the greatest possible effect is produced through the slowness of perception. But al-Mutanabbi's willingness to really go for it is why these lines often show up in manuals of rhetoric and grammar and are used as examples of different kinds of rhetorical figures. For further reading, there's a great entry by Andrash Hamouri on al-Mutanabī in Essays in Arabic Literary Biography, Volume 2, 925 to 1350. I'd also recommend A.J. Arbery's Poems of al-Mutanabī. The language is a bit older sounding, but very, very useful. A lot of poems get translated. It's probably the largest number of poems translated into Arabic and into English in any one collection. And then also Margaret Larkin has a book for the Makers of the Muslim World series on al-Mutanabbī. There's also a tremendous website called Waḥat al-Mutanabbī, the Valley of al-Mutanabbī. It's in Arabic with texts of his poems and commentaries, but also information about his life, multimedia resources, and so on. It's a really good resource.
And finally, let's end with a sample and translation.
One of al-Mutanabbi's most famous odes, it celebrates the battle for al-Hadath, which was an important fortress in Cilicia in 954 AD. Some years earlier, Sayf ad-Dawlaḥ had tried to surrender the fort to the Byzantines, who later burned it. And then Sayf ad-Dawlaḥ re-entered it now to make repairs when a huge Byzantine army led by the Domesticus Bardas Phocas attacked. And reports say that the Muslim army was about to break when Sayf ad-Dawlaḥ himself fought his way to the Domesticus, the leader of these Byzantine forces, and routed the Byzantines. And this is the poem on that occasion. It's not the most famous poem by al-Mutanabbī, which is the one that starts, it's to Sayf ad-Dawlaḥ, and it's the one that starts, "Oh, for the heart, burning with pain for one whose heart is cold, who thinks ill of me, body and soul." And that's the one that has famous lines like, "Night and desert and horses, they know me, as do the sword and the spear, the pen and the parchment." It also had that other poem, which I'm not going to read, also has my favorite line probably in all of Arabic poetry, not just al-Mutanabbi's, which is, "If you see the lion bare his fangs, don't assume that the lion is smiling." So, but that's not what we're reading today. What we're reading today is this poem celebrating the successful battle for al-Hadath, and just some selections from that in the translation of Andrash Hamori. Sayf ad-Dawlaḥ demands from men valor like his own, to which even lions cannot pretend. The longest-lived birds pledge their lives to his weapons, the desert vultures from their fledglings to their ancient ones. It cannot harm them that they were created without hard talons, for his hilts and blades have been created. Can al-Hadath, the red fort, distinguish its own color? Does it know which of the two rains was shed by the clouds? Before his arrival, the white clouds had rained on it, but after he had come, it was watered by men's skulls. He built it, and then raised it as high as spear struck on spear, as the waves of death clashed about it. Something like a demonic possession had held it in its grip, and then it was strung with amulets made of the bodies of the slain. Changeable time had driven it off as plunder, but with your spear, brought it back to the faith in spite of time. You force the passing knights to renounce what you have seized, while they, when they seize something of yours, remain your debtors. The Byzantines came against you heavy with iron. In the long chainmail their horses seemed without legs. When the sunlight flashed from them, their swords could not be distinguished because their armor and the helmets sparkled just like the blades. Theirs was a fivefold army whose march filled east and west, and whose thunder reached the ears of Gemini. All tongues and nations mingled in it, so that only interpreters could make the speakers understand each other. God, what a time it was! Its fire melted the ignoble alloy, and there remained only the sharp sword and the bold champion. What could not cut through armor and spear was cut to pieces. The knights who could not bear the brunt of the clash had to flee. You took your stand where none could doubt that death awaited him, as if you stood enclosed by the very eyelid of destruction while destruction slept. Wounded warriors moved past you in defeat, but your face was radiant and your mouth wore a smile. You exceeded the limits of valor and intelligence until it was said that you knew the things hidden from man. You folded the two wings of that army back against its heart, and their plumes died in that folding. With a blow that fell upon their heads when victory was remote and reached their collarbones as victory arrived. You despised the Rudani spears and cast them aside so that the swords seemed to rebuke the spears. Whoever seeks a glorious victory, the keys to it are the quick, sharp, white blades. You scattered their dead all over Udayhib Hill as silver dirhams are scattered over a bride. In pursuit of the fleeing, your horses trampled the nests of vultures on the mountain peaks, although all around them you left ample food. Their fledglings think you brought their mothers to them, but you came with strong, noble horses. When their feet slipped, you made them crawl on their bellies, as dappled snakes crawl on the face of the earth. Will that Domesticus advance day after day, although the back of his neck reproaches his face for advancing? Does he not know the lion's smell before he meets him? The very beasts recognize the smell of a lion.
Dr. Blankinship, thank you.
Thank you, Talha.